Hello everyone, and welcome to another CIH podcast. Really appreciate your time and hope you'll find a lot of value out of today's podcast, because we have a great panel of speakers here today to talk about ASB and focusing on prevention being better than cure. How do we get in early, identify where ASB it has a risk of escalating, and what are some of the early interventions that we can do to stop it in its tracks and to mean that it causes less harm to individuals and to communities. So I'm really pleased today to say that we have got Chris Grose, who's the Chief Exec of Chris Grose Training and Consultancy, and is an active CIH member and chairs our ASB network, who's coming today. And also I'd like to introduce Claire Seymour, who is the ASB lead, lots of experience in the field and is an associate with Chris Grose Training, and Dave Walker, who is the Director of Mediation at Calm Mediation. So today we're going to have some really good discussions about what can we do early on to actually identify and tackle ASB before it causes real harm to communities and to individuals. And we'll hear from this great panel. So having introduced everyone, I'd just like to set us off really by thinking about how do housing practitioners, how can they identify at an early stage where low-level nuisance has the risk of escalating into, ASB that can cause serious harm? So what are some of the signs? How good are we at identifying those signs and getting in early? And what are some really, what do you see as potential good interventions? So I'm going to kick off with Chris. With all your experience in the field, Chris, what kind of things do you feel would set your antennae going about this is low level at the moment, but it could be a problem if we don't get in quickly?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me. Well, first of all, how long is this podcast? I could go on for a long time to answer this question. But I think the first thing, actually, just picking up on some language there, actually, is are we saying it right to start with? And this isn't to critique, but in the question we talk about low level nuisance, and actually I think really what we should be saying is low risk. And just good thinking point about the language that we use, and when I say we, housing professionals in the sector, we really need to start talking differently about antisocial behaviour, because low level could very much sound quite condescending, quite patronising, almost like, yeah, it's not really meeting our criteria to do anything. Whereas low risk is far more tangible in terms of comparing it to something that is an immediacy, something that needs to be dealt with today, stop everything. So I think that's the first point, actually, is just understanding the power of our words, because they affect our thoughts, feelings and behaviours. And just to give you like a quick example, actually, to focus on kind of how things can quickly escalate, but how sometimes we don't see those indicators because of the language that we used. And it's something that we use in our training, actually, which we refer to as the PEN acronym: personal, environmental and nuisance. Now, this will be old school for some of your listeners. They'll be like, yeah, I know that. We've done that before. Now, if I could quickly take you on a journey, and I've said journey and the word quick, so you're probably thinking that's never going to happen, but I promise I won't be too long. But let's take ball games as an example, right? Kids playing ball games, that kind of stuff. That's something that we should all be encouraging, of course. But let's say that children are playing ball games outside of Sarah's house, Dave's house and Claire's house. And Dave, you live in between Sarah and Claire. What a wonderful street that would be, Dave. And I'm playing with my mates outside, kicking balls in and out of people's gardens, not intentionally, but just having a bit of fun. Now, if we take the PEN, personal environmental nuisance kind of acronym in our kind of structures of how we label ASB, it might be that Sarah, Dave and Claire are keen gardeners and they don't want us trampling over all of their garden. They don't want to put their foot on the brakes because the cars are having to stop because balls are going out in the road. You could argue that that could be seen as a nuisance, yeah? Yeah? Yep. Okay, so let's take nuisance there. We've then got personal and environmental. Well, personal is typically where somebody might be targeted because it's them. It's intentionally trying to cause somebody harm. And then you've got the environmental kind of impact, damage to the landscape of where you live, let's say. So let's take those ball games as a nuisance to start with. So not something that needs to be dealt with immediately. However, it's causing a bit of a nuisance. One day, Dave comes out, he's had enough. He grabs our ball and he pops it in front of us and he says, Scarpa, you lot have had enough. Sounds like something you might do, Dave, but we'll move on. Anyway, we come back the day after. We've got balls, cheap from Sports Direct. Other sports equipment is available, but we are now kicking the ball up against Dave's door day in, day out. We're no longer outside of Sarah's property or Claire's property because your front door makes for a great goalpost, Dave, and your car and your garden. And you become the primary kind of subject to ball games. Now, the point that I'm now about to make, Sarah, so don't panic. When the phone call comes in to a housing provider from Dave saying those kids are playing ball games outside of my house, it's highly likely that the housing provider would say, nah, sorry, we don't deal with ball games. If you see what I'm saying. But if we take the PEN approach, personal, environmental, and nuisance, if we ask questions like who, what, why, where, when, and more importantly, why, Dave, do you think this is happening? That's when we start to uncover things like vulnerability, context, targeted behavior, and personal becomes a real thing. And to answer your question, sometimes we try and pigeonhole things into a very simplistic box of low, medium, high level, whereas really we should be thinking on risk and what lies underneath that. And that's a prime example of getting it right versus how easily you could get it wrong by dismissing something that appears to be like not really my problem. Does that hopefully that kind of makes sense? That's my take on risk and how we go about it.
And that's a really interesting and excellent starting point, because obviously there with the kind of consumer standards and all the stuff that's been coming out of the housing ombudsman, really what we need to be doing is understanding who lives behind the front door and
Exactly.
what our tenants have in terms of vulnerabilities that might make it much more of an issue for them, and actually to be taken much more seriously. So I think that's a really valid point, and I will be shifting my language just as I did from victim to harm. I shall be turning to from level to risk.
I promise I
Noted.
wasn't having a dig, Sarah.
No, it's a valid point. I'm always ready to learn, Chris. So that's brilliant. Thank you. But I just thought I'd bring in Claire with your reflections on that. I mean, I'm guessing that you've applied this kind of thing in your experience. So I was wondering if you wanted to add anything to Chris's journey point, which was brilliant. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. And I attended Chris's training many moons ago. So I remember this fondly and now deliver it myself. And it's absolutely right, because from that point, then it helps us tailor a response that is appropriate. And thinking around what we've just talked around about language, it's thinking about the impacts. And those vulnerabilities, and having that collectively, that holistic approach to actually how we are going to identify and therefore tailor the response to the issues that we see. And I think it got me thinking about something we're doing at the moment, and that's around assertive outreach, and that is about identifying those vulnerabilities as soon as we receive reports, so that we can have and it's something that Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance say actually as well, and whilst that's a separate thing altogether, but the concept is the same, and that is a whole housing approach. What do we know about this person? What's happened here before? What are there hotspot areas? Have we missed anything that's gone on previous and it hasn't been dealt with and it's come up again? And it's really taking that in-depth a view so that we can tailor a response. So that assertive outreach really we've applied in the housing context so that we can get our foot in the doors early, identifying mental health, drug or alcohol issues that we might need to really bring in other supporting agencies. But we can really only do that if we know our customers and know our communities and what that impact is. And that's why it really follows on from what Chris has just said, really being aware of PEN, understanding what you're actually dealing with and what you know. But that, as well, I often notice, of course, that can change, and it can change quite quickly. So we need to be really, really agile and make sure that we have really good contact plans with our victims, making sure that we have action plans and plans with them, communication plans that are appropriate for them. So it's really making sure that we've had all those discussions, and really that does start with an effective triage process, which I spent a lot of time on recently. We've just introduced 2 of these roles where I currently work, and that is to have an effective triage to recognise all of this from the initial call, so that there isn't those delays. And again, something the Ombudsman has really picked up on. It's got to be timely, and we've got to identify these issues really early doors, so that actually we can bring in these amazing services that obviously Dave works for, through mediation where it's appropriate, of course, that can really, really have an enormously positive impact on communities if we bring that in early enough. But the longer that isn't, as long as all of those needs are recognised early doors, that's when we can tailor the response appropriately, without any delay causing it to escalate, of course. And that's the whole purpose we're here today, isn't it? Prevention's better than cure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting as you said that, and you made the reference to DAHA. I think sometimes we feel that we need to make take special action or special measures in a way to address vulnerability. But actually, if we have robust systems that enable us to work on a personal level and understand who that person, who the people behind our front door, what their family needs are, etc. It's not in any way a kind of like special, but it means it's tailored. Do you know what I mean? So it's actually creating a robust approach that you can use flexibility, whatever people's needs are in that situation. Whether it's somebody who's experienced domestic abuse, or whether it's somebody with disabilities, or learning disabilities. It's actually, or we've got to remember that vulnerabilities can change, as you pointed out, and actually we need to be able to respond quickly as situations change and people's circumstances change. So actually it's not about creating special responses, it's about creating personalized human contact, isn't it, really, actually, for ASB and for a plethora of our services. So that's really interesting. I was reflecting on that as you spoke, but I just wondered if I could bring Dave in now, and thinking about Chris's journey, etc. I wondered where, in terms of where you've seen mediation brought in successfully, have you seen a kind of pattern of where it's, there are some levels of risk at which people bring you in, or your services in, or look for your training for their own staff, or, are there missed opportunities that you think we should be looking at in terms of risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are missed opportunities. I think I can't stand the word mediation. I say this to people every day. It's mediation. I don't like the word. It's a conversation we should have had ages ago, and now we got the chance. And I think if you were to ask someone to draw a picture of mediation, they would have 2 people maybe sitting opposite 2 mediators. And I think this is the point that sometimes we're missing, that I'm much rather class myself as a community facilitator, on the basis that I'm facilitating dialogue and understanding. And I think if they're looking out their window, they're seeing a group of guys standing in the park, drinking lager and putting the music on, the last thing they're going to want to do is this image of me taking them somewhere and putting them in a room with 20 guys drinking a lager. And obviously that's not what we do. And I think, to go back to your point, I think if it can be addressed or highlighted, what we're very keen for is for housing associations and councils to give us a call and go, I don't know if you can deal with this, but someone's moaning about someone playing in a park or playing on the grass on the estate, and I just wonder what you think we could possibly do. Because the first thing we would do is say, who's complaining, who's raised this? Can we pop and see them? And I'll give you an example. it's interesting how the dynamics of housing are changing, because we had a situation, to give you a scenario on how it worked, we had a situation where there was a public park. It's been there for years and years and years and years. The council, obviously trying to generate money, sold a car park and got a developer to put a lovely big posh block of flats on it. Flats were costing about 400, 500 pound a piece. Of course, people moved in, looked at the plans, looked at it in the daytime and said, this is lovely. I've now got a park outside my window. But obviously, by the end of the evening, guys were turning up. They were meeting there, having a lager. Music was going on. And they started to contact the police. They were very well organised, upwardly mobile people that could go straight through to the chief executive of the council and the superintendent and Scotland Yard and everyone like that. So all of a sudden, this was on people's radar. It went right to the top, and then it was coming down going, what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing? Now, what was interesting about this was it was a police officer that got me introduced to the guys in the park. But first we went and met people in the blocks. They went there playing music. They're there till late at night, sometimes early hours. What are they doing? Stuff like that. And I said, okay, fine. Maybe I'll go and talk to them. And a police officer got me introduced to them. And the first thing they did when they see me was to hug me and say, we need to talk to these people in the blocks because they keep sending the police down on us and they're searching us, and then we're not dealing drugs and la, 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 la. So we want to talk to them. And they shared their stories with me. Some of them, for them, what was interesting was the people in the blocks said, I feel like they're in my living room. And the people in the parks were saying, this is our living room because we've got no balconies, we've got no gardens. Some of them were caring for relatives. They'd come there at 5 o'clock at night. It was their way of being safe together. So what we done was we got a selection of people from the park who we worked with. We didn't even actually know everybody's names. We knew nothing of their addresses because they were like mobile. And some of them had street names, but we got 3 of them together. We got a big group of residents come along. There must have been about over 12 of them, and friends of the park who love everybody and want to do good work in the park, and a park warden. And what was interesting was, first thing that struck me was that we were all from all over the world. The people in the blocks were from Russia and Canada, and they were, finance and stuff like that. So they come from all over the world. The people in the parks, heritage was Afro-Caribbean, African, South American. So I'd done a little drawing of a world, stuck it on a post-it, big sheet, and said, right, here we go. First things first, what's our heritage? And I said, here's mine, Irish, Scottish. Whacked it up on the board, and everybody put up there, Barbadian, West Indian, Caribbean, Jamaican, Colombia, Canada. And it was an interesting leveler because it showed that we were all from all over the world, that we gravitate to the borough of Southwark in terms of that. And then we split them into groups and asked them what they felt the other groups wanted. And they were bang on the money. So the people in the posh blocks, said they want somewhere to hang out and congregate together, and the people in the park said what they want is peace and quiet after a certain time. Now, what was interesting, going back to one of Chris's points, was when we asked the people in the block what time they felt the music should go off, they said 9 o'clock. And the people in the parks who were allegedly responsible for this said, are you mad? You probably best make it 7:30, right? So it automatically dropped from what their expectation was. And also they were saying, whenever I phone the police or the noise team, they never turn up. And someone at the parks group said, here's my mobile number. If anyone goes past 7:30, call me. So they got a 24-hour service. And this young lady who was one of the people in the parks group, said, if anyone calls me, I will go over the park and tell them to turn it down. So what we done was we come up with an agreement in terms of what time the music would go off, the understanding that, certain places in the park were causing more disturbance, and that they were more than happy to move to a more central part of the park to meet up. And then the people understood that they, their lifestyles, they didn't know anything about the people in the park and what their lives were like. We had people that were sofa surfing. We had people that were homeless. They said to me, like, why are they in the park at, 12 o'clock? And it was like, because they're homeless and they'll go down to the 24-hour McDonald's and buy a coffee and just sit there in the warm. So sharing that information with permission was good. And then at the end of it, we got a Southwark Council sign and we stuck all the flags that represented the heritage around the outside. And the sign said, the community have come together and agreed that the music goes off at 7:30 p.m. Now, what happened was the people in the parks then policed it. So when they had a guy turn up with a Bluetooth speaker who was playing his music, they went, oi, we've got an agreement now. It goes off at 7:30. And the bloke was like, yeah, whatever. And they went, well, you carry on doing it. We're going to take that speaker off you. And the guy come back and he done it. And they went, right, you've had your chance. They took it off of him. They said, you can get that back in 2 days. So the people in the parks then policed the playing of the music. So I go back to this point that first and foremost, we'd love our colleagues in housing trusts and councils to just pick the phone up and go, what do you think about this? And the fact that we would be more than happy to go and see anyone and talk to them and say what's going on, because otherwise one of the key questions we ask anyone we deal with, even if I work with gang related shooting stabbings and homicides, neighbours, anything like that, is how do you think the other people see you? Now, the people in the blocks would say that we want to kick these people out the park and don't want them back on that. And say, like, how do you think, they would see you? And they go, look, that we don't care. We play our music. We don't care about anyone else. And that's who we are. And it's not who they are. They weren't about kicking the people out the park. The people were about understanding that they did have, living rooms and children's in these apartments and that they needed to keep the music down. But if we just hit them with enforcement, and I want to be clear on this, everyone thinks mediators are soft and fluffy. Do I look soft and fluffy? Right. So we are very happy that there needs to be lines in the sand and there needs to be laws and regulations. And we will work with police, noise team, antisocial behaviour units, and share with people, what is your understanding of the law? What do you think they can do? So we all know what people can do, but is there a way that we can avoid that? So that is a given, and that will happen. If you carry on breaking stuff, they will come down, they will nick you, they will issue with a warrant. So I think my point is this, please pick the phone up, give us a call and just run it past us, however low risk it may present itself at the beginning, because the longer it goes on, and Chris was bang on the money, the longer it goes on, the frustration comes out and people go and go, God, get out of it, you horrible, whatever it may be. Then you've got the parent coming down and going, don't you talk to my children like that. And then we're in a war zone, okay? Yeah. And then it could get physical. So we have a duty of care to move quickly, because at least if I'm talking to the person that's complaining about the ball games and saying, look, I've had kids, but they're kicking it. I had it the other day with a ball game one. The guy went, I don't understand why people are moaning. He went, they were kicking the ball up against my wall. I went out and went, oi, lads, do us a favour. Couldn't move around a corner, could you? And they went, you all right, mate? And they just disappeared. He went, yeah. What's the problem? I didn't shout.
I think as this is a podcast, I'll just point out you don't sound soft and fluffy either, Dave, but it makes a lot of sense actually, because very often a lot of the problems come about because of assumptions that are made of how people will interact and what their aims are and what whether they bother about other people, isn't it? And actually having those conversations, director of conversation at Calm Mediation there, that's actually a really, really important thing. I wonder, having got that scope and just recognize that actually, yes, we need to get in there early. We need to identify that no matter what in our, as a busy housing officer, what might seem important to us, actually it's how it impacts on people's lives and their perception of it that we need to take into account and understand what risks it introduces for them. What are landlords doing about this? I mean, how good are landlords at spotting and identifying the risk and actually stepping in early? I think this is time to draw out, some top tips you might have had from your experience, and what you've seen as good practice around. And I just wonder if if we can explore and expand that a little bit. So I don't know, Chris, can I come back to you for your reflections with all the experience you've got with landlords?
I think this is the quietest I've been in some time, Sarah.
Yeah.
So it's about time. But yeah, no, there's lots here, and just to kind of, I think a lot of this comes back to asking the question why. You've heard from myself, Claire, and Dave, and the thing that kind of came out, particularly in Dave's story, is the why do you think this is happening? And often the kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. And from my days of actually managing ASB, and I noticed what Dave said, and I always say this too, is with permission, sharing. And not always can you, which is frustrating sometimes for housing professionals, when you know that there may be reasons why somebody's causing ASB, and that may be through a mental health, living with mental health condition, a vulnerability of some kind, or adverse childhood experience. But once you build the rapport with that individual, and you can say, look, actually, if they knew what you were going through, it makes such a difference in knowing that it's not personal, and actually it's an outcome of some of the things you're finding that are difficult. I've definitely seen those things be a game changer, actually to the point where their neighbours actually start looking out for them, almost a paternal kind of instinct. So definitely kind of that would be one. Moving around some of your kind of questioning around like some practical things. First of all, in terms of process, you mentioned there needs to be a process in place. Couldn't agree more. There has to be process for consistency, etc. But if you read a lot of the Housing Ombudsman severe maladministrations, risk assessing is one of the top ones. We hosted our roundtable only a month ago, Sarah, with the Housing Ombudsman, and we heard that risk assessing or poor risk assessing. Now, what I just want to pick up on is sometimes in a busy working world, we can turn into robots. If you place a process in front of someone, all of our kind of juices stop flowing because we have to kind of answer those questions. So when you look at a risk assessment, depending on which ones we're referring to, but often known as the RAM, the risk assessment matrix, might have 12 to 15 questions in it, and we follow it in chronological order. What I would say, and I'll make this snappy because this is a podcast, but basically, long short of it is have conversations with people and retrospectively complete your risk assessments. And when I say retrospectively, I don't mean in a week's time, but people shouldn't feel like they're being processed. If I asked a direct question, do you have a disability? Are you a vulnerable person? Most responses would be, why on earth are you asking me about that? Do you know what I mean? Is the outcome of that question important? You're darn right it is. It's really important for us to know what to do next. But by having a conversation with someone, how are things at the moment? How's this affecting you? How does it make you feel? And then someone starts to open up. I think that would be a critical area to start. So making sure we don't just process people through a linear kind of very defined set of questions. We have to understand how to interpret the answers rather than giving the answers. How often does this happen, Sarah? Daily, weekly, monthly, occasionally? Well, if I'm going to give you the answers, Sarah, you're probably going to say daily. But if I just kind of say, how often is it happening? You'll just tell me the truth, most likely, rather than over-egging the pudding. So that would be one area to start. In terms of some practical things, I'll reel them off and give some others a chance. But, it's 2025, so there's a lot of apps that are out there these days, which are pretty handy, particularly in terms of like self-referral kind of systems where some residents can kind of log evidence in real time. They can record things in real time. They can upload from their smartphones some CCTV footage, maybe that kind of stuff. So definitely tech is getting better. There's still a way to go, and one of the challenges I see with a lot of my clients is trying to use really great ASB tech that's out there in a wider housing management system. That is often the challenge that IT kind of get a little bit kind of nervous about, like introducing a new system. But I do see the tail wagging the dog quite a lot with systems driving the agenda rather than real great professionals. Training staff on indicators and escalation processes. So teaching them to be professionally curious. I know it's a popular word, but it's darn well true. When things don't add up, why don't they add up? Understand the people. So getting them to be nosy. Most housing professionals are pretty nosy. They love this stuff. So getting them to be curious about the answers. And then Dave's kind of soft and fluffy comment. It's a really good one. So what we want to be doing is not forgetting the basics of a well-written letter, a thought-provoking visit, an empathetic approach when vulnerabilities become clear, or even a robust message, using all the tools in your locker. And Claire mentioned the word agile. Couldn't agree more. That agility to be different versions of yourself to your audience is massively important. And sometimes people say, oh no, I am the way I am. Well, actually, you're probably not going to be that great then, because we're all weird and wonderful as people. Do you know what I mean? We all have different ways of doing things or responding to things. So one of my big areas is around helping housing professionals with the skills to communicate brilliantly. When they need to be enforcing, then be enforcing, but don't go too soon, because if you go too soon, you'll end up becoming a toothless tiger, and that will spread on social media. They don't know this from this. They're never going to do it, that kind of stuff. So if you're going to bark, make sure you can bite would be a strap line that I think you could use, or else don't bark, because people will spot it a mile off.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to come to you, Claire, and just say, from your reflections, what do you think, are there a few things that you feel, and I mean, what's coming out really clearly is communicating and conversation, and really actually having that, just wanting to know and ask the questions that explore what's really behind the situations that are presenting as ASB or as nuisance. But Claire, I just wondered, from your experience, what are there some things that you would say, in addition to what Chris has spoken about, that you just feel this has really worked? When you see housing officers going in to a situation with this kind of approach, it's a really, an empathetic approach, etc. It really kind of actually starts the ball rolling. Are there some things that you feel within that armory that Chris has talked about that actually can really trigger something happening and start the process rolling? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, actually, I might just go back even further, if that's all right. And it's following on for something you were saying, Dave, when you gave that really, really lovely and quite impactful, wasn't it? Profound kind of story that you gave. And I just was thinking around the development stage, right? And having worked for a large housing provider and developer for a number of years, I now work for a local authority, but when I worked for them, one of the things that I made a point of doing was building a really, really strong relationship with our development team. So that actually, first and foremost, I noticed some of the tensions that you were dealing with, Dave, was of perhaps poor design, so we used to go out with on site, and we really built this really effective relationship where so myself and my team, the officer for the area, would come out with me, with them, and we would give our opinions on some of the risk factors we might see. It could be just the design of the garden, the car parks, where we could see where those tensions could start based on our experience. That partnership I will never forget as being really a profound one, because we were really getting there even before the customers were in. So that was a really, really effective partnership. And secondly, I was thinking around, and actually I think this has been covered off a little bit, but focusing on the root cause. I mean, really the two most core important principles of when you're managing ASB is, of course, communication, and secondly is problem solving. And I know it sounds silly, but we get so caught up in, like what Chris said, that kind of robotic stance, whereas actually are we having fluidity with problem solving, thinking outside the box? Yes, we have policy procedures, of course they're there for good reason, but actually we're dealing with some very complex needs, complex situations sometimes, where we may just need to think better, think differently. We are living in a time where Chris has talked about tech. I mean, it's quite extraordinary at times, and we could really use that to our benefit. Although, don't get me wrong, that can sometimes be a trigger for issues too. So we have to be balanced with that, of course. And the other thing I was thinking about, and really just thinking about Dave's example, and many occasions where I think this needs to be shouted about, to be honest, is when we talk about partnership work. When we say partnership straight away, everybody instantly thinks, don't they, of police, social services, community mental health, and youth services, and so on. But actually, the number one partnership should be the community. You know, they have the local knowledge, they've got the community networks, they've got those relationships. So certainly this is something that I often speak about with my team, is that's where we must pay the first and foremost attention. And we've had some really effective outcomes from varying examples. And I remember using some Home Office communications through literature around recognising county lines. You know, okay, we do the joint visits with police, but actually, if we're not telling the community what to look for, and what to identify and how they can work with us and the channels to report through, etc., then actually we're doing a disservice. So we must place a lot of attention there first and foremost, and then, you know, good things hopefully will follow, right? So I've seen some really powerful work, and actually that's why I touched on that point that you made, Dave, is that actually going in the community, getting to know who your community is, and we should know that from the offset of the relationship with them. Again, I go through that. It's that whole housing approach always. We're such, I say this with kindness, we're such busy fools. We don't sometimes just stop, take a moment to read, reflect, who is it, what are the trends, what have we seen before, what's the data showing us, you know, and what are those hotspot areas, and who's already involved with this community, with this family or individual. And actually, if we just slow it down sometimes, get all that information together, it can be so powerful to know the next steps to take.
So actually, you've hit on something that really was one of my other kind of questions, I think, for us to discuss, and that's that thorny matter of partnership. And I think it was really valuable, Claire, that you actually say first and foremost, it's got to be the partnership with the community that you're working with, but I just wondered, because obviously as it's not, I mean, consumer regulation is not about tick box. I think the regulator is really clear on that. It's about you knowing your tenants. It's about knowing your communities. It's about working with them. But nevertheless, there is more of an expectation around housing organisations working effectively in partnership. And we, you know, Chris will know we have the discussions endlessly in the network about the capacity of our statutory partners to be able to work well in partnership with us. It's always an ongoing challenge. But I wonder whether we could draw out actually about, you know, where things, how things are managed well in partnership and what's made it work and the difference that can make, and, you know, how have maybe some landlords gone about actually getting those partnerships working together. And I don't know, Claire, since you started talking about partnership and mentioned about community, can I start with you, and then I'll go on to Chris and Dave about their examples of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, we mustn't ignore the elephant in the room. We know that our services really are very stretched. However, we know equally in equal measure that if we're not working in strong and effective ways together, that actually further down the line, it's like losing capacity to create capacity, is what I like to throw around, that actually we must invest in these partnerships. We need to show up where we need to show up, you know. So I'm thinking safeguarding boards, you know, making sure that we are at those intelligent meetings. I know they call them different things in different areas, of course, but making sure we're showing up, you know. I understand that in some areas that they'll only attend places where they've got the highest stock numbers, which of course I understand, but actually could we at least show up every other month or something, just really trying to show that presence and that relationship building, which can be critical for several cases, but just one would be enough, right? So I know with housing as well, they often build properties in pockets of areas around the country, and that can be quite challenging. Where I was before, I covered 42 local authority areas, for example. So I, of course, couldn't attend 42 lots of different partnership meetings all over the place, but it is really trying to be as pragmatic as possible, showing up, showing face, and contributing. And I think in terms of partnership, the relationships are absolutely fundamental, aren't they? We do sometimes, certainly actually where I currently am, which I think really is effective, whilst we attend the monthly Intel meetings, which is obviously very common practice, but we also have a standalone housing, ASB and policing meeting as well, which is just purely focusing on housing related ASB, and that is a really effective forum. But we have buy-in, you know, and we've created a really, really good relationship. So it does mean losing some capacity to create it and giving it the time that it deserves, because it will pay back in dividends, if I could put it like that.
No, thank you. I suppose one of the questions is, you know, how do we get into those partnerships and get them to develop at that early stage to identify early risk, as Chris was pointing out. Because quite often those partnerships are invoked when it's difficult, when it's escalated. So actually how that relationship building, Claire, that you touched on, that's really critical, isn't it? It's to be able to develop the trust so that you can deal with things more quickly. So I thought, if I come to you, Chris, and then come to Dave about, you know, partnership, how do we get it happening at that low risk level? How can we build that up? Because it will help with capacity all round, won't it? Which is always a struggle for partnerships in this area.
Yeah. It's a really tricky one, actually, Sarah, because I'm ever the optimist, but usually what makes people's ears prick up is the C word, crisis. Because that's when we all start panicking, thinking, right, who's accountable? Where is anyone breaking the law? What's our statutory responsibility? And I would love to talk to you about prevention and early intervention around partnership working. And there are lots of examples. I do appreciate that. But unfortunately, there's just too many kind of poor ones, because we're all, you mentioned busy fools earlier, Claire. That's often what it is. Our heads are down dealing with so many kind of tricky issues. And what often housing professionals are saying, that they feel like a social worker, they feel like a GP, they feel like a police officer, etc. So what we've spent a lot of time on is one thing I constantly talk about, is particularly around kind of vulnerable adults, is they usually all have a voice, but they don't have a platform to speak. Whereas you do. So speak well. So we teach them a lot around speaking well, and even though this is probably a crass way of doing it, but it's quite literally taking one-liners from the Care Act, for example, explaining to them about mental capacity, for example, around empowerment, consent, all of these things. Now, the reason why we kind of focus in these areas of technicalities is because it's the only way to get statutory agencies to actually accept things, because they know that you know. And I think, you know, the whole knowledge is power thing. I know it's a cliche, but it's definitely true. I remember being on partnership meetings back in the day. I'm going back a couple of decades now, and granted, I was really young, and maybe that was partly my inexperience and stuff, but I felt this feeling of what I call professional snobbery. Like, what's he doing here? He's housing. He's not qualified to be here. And that's one of the reasons why I really love that we're in a kind of sector at the moment which is really starting to professionalize itself. Now, look, I've worked with professionals for years and years. Housing is a very professional sector, in my view, in my opinion. But now it's officially going to be professional, if that makes sense. So I think one of the areas is around speaking well, being qualified, having the right training, understanding of the tools, the powers, making reference to the community, what used to be the community remedy, but the ASB case review. So sometimes what I always say is start low with your partners. All right, so start off with empathy and understanding how blooming difficult it is, because all you really need to do is look in the mirror, because that's what it's like in housing. So it's no different in social care or the police and the other agencies. So start off low with understanding, and then escalate as you need to with speaking well, but definitely get to the point where you do make something happen. because vulnerable people and victims, and I use my words carefully, are victims of antisocial behaviour. They don't have platforms to speak like us lot do. So I think those are a few little kind of things that I would kind of say to kind of get people, hold them to account. Certainly the ASB case review can raise issues. And it's interesting you said about the regulator. I will make this very quick, but under the consumer standards, there's very much an emphasis under the Safer Neighbourhoods specific expectations on partnership working, as you rightly say. I don't think housing has a problem with working in partnership. They are asking for it daily. The challenge is partners actually coming to the table because there's simply not enough of them. This isn't their fault. It's a political thing. It's underfunded. So we have to speak well and go to the top of the pile where we possibly can.
Okay. No, that's really valuable points there, actually, Chris. Dave, I wondered from your perspective, in terms of, have you had experience where, you've obviously said you're keen for housing landlords to call on the services of mediation and to get it in early and to broker those conversations that often we've missed the opportunity to. That's often when it escalates, isn't it? But I wonder if you've got reflections on good partnerships that actually enable things to to do the prevention better than cure, to do that early intervention that nip things in the bud. If you've got some reflections on that.
Yeah, I think it is a lot down to our relationships with the housing officers and the parks officers on the ground, because they're the ones that are really aware of this happening. And it's far better for them to call us and go, I think there's something bubbling here. We've had some complaints come through, whatever it may be. But it does. The reason one of our catchphrases is "give us your nightmares," and give it to us. We'll run with it. Just put the ball in our court, and we'll keep you updated. But we'll go and reach out to this person. We'll have a chat with them. We'll find out what's going on. So they actually don't feel they're under pressure. So to answer your question, the way that partnership really works well is at a really low level, and that's a housing officer or a parks officer calling us and letting us know something's going on and having a chat. They're a great source of intelligence in terms of background on the people on the ground and to know what's going on, who they are, what they're like, what their issues are like, what they're like when they've had a drink, those sort of things. Do we go down there at a certain time of day? If we're going to go down there at 9 o'clock at night, then, they're all going to be drunk. So is it possible to go down there earlier? So we've always been, touch wood, particularly safe by going down there based on the lovely information that they give us and that the fact they may even give us an introduction to meet with someone. And we only need one to start the ball rolling. It's a bit of the gangs mediation we do. It's you find someone that's trusted within the community that can give you a recommendation that he's not police. And I say I've got no power. The biggest power I have is having no power. So they're not worried about me arresting them, searching them, evicting them, warning them. And I think going back to an earlier point, that people look at the websites of councils and housing trusts, they look up about, antisocial behaviour and how seriously the council take it. And I feel sometimes council officers or housing trust officers are under a lot of pressure to send out a letter to someone and say, we've had a report of antisocial behaviour, and maybe in that is an example that you run the risk of, breach of your tenancy agreement and stuff like that. So straight away, it's turned into, not only do you not like me or my kids, you want to throw us all out in the street. So, by engaging with the person that be looked on as the victim and actually going, what is it you want? Do you want them evicted? Go, of course I don't want them evicted. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I understand it, but it's causing me a nuisance and it's driving me mad. And, I've got this sensory thing where, if the ball's up against my wall, it drives me crazy and I'll get really wound up. Stuff like that. And as Chris pointed out, if you're in a position, so many times when people have given me permission to share, that when I've shared that and saying they're finding this difficult, someone's gone, my sister's like that, or I've actually got a sister who's an heroin addict. It's destroyed our family. So I sort of get, what's going on with them. That, those sorts of things and, personal experience of what that's like is, as you said, it just suddenly breaks those barriers down. So partnership, the lower level, the better. Because I find it's a little bit of a waste of time for me to go to these big meetings where You know, they got loads of stuff on the agenda, and not a lot of it's mine that can come my way. And I think when people are locked into, when a victim has been taken down a route, and I think Chris touched on this earlier, when a victim has been taken down the route of, you know, there is enforcement and we can do this, when someone goes, hello, mediation, they're like, forget it, it's too late. So we like to get them ready, and we're more than happy if they go, do you know what, I'd rather go down the enforcement route. That is completely fine. Our process is voluntary, so you can do whatever you want, but we're always here should you change your mind. So low level is the answer to that question.
That's brilliant, thank you. So, and a positive note to end on, just I think, just to summarize, some of the things that have really come across strongly to me is that actually, you know, what housing officers need to do, ASB officers, and what their employers need to trust them with is actually to make sure that they can go out, have the time to have those conversations, understand the people and what they're experiencing and how it feels like for them. You know, why is it particularly difficult for them to shape a kind of response that enables them to have those conversations. You know, actually have those conversations with the housing officer, maybe to understand also the kid kicking the ball against the door. I did think when you said about that, Chris, that actually if you saw my garden, you'd know that I wouldn't be bothered about mopping it, landing it at all. It's a complete mess. But anyway, that aside, you know, actually it's about that, and that's where it comes into, isn't it? Understanding people and understanding the difference that some of the everyday activities that people engage in can actually impact differently, and that's all about having the time.
That's why people come into housing. So it's a natural thing for housing professionals to do. And sometimes we make the mistake by over prescribing. There needs to be prescription, of course, but we should encourage professional judgment, curiosity, and agility. Yeah. And the best organizations that I work with really kind of foster that culture, and they manage quality and consistency through regular case reviews and supervision, but not as a punitive or performance related, as a fresh pair of eyes, second point of view type thing. So it's definitely the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, Chris. That is why a lot of us are in this sector and love it. So I am going to, I feel like we could carry on talking about so much. It's such a brilliant panel we've had today, but I do have to draw it to a close. And I hope that actually it's really given people some good tips and something to take away, and actually some real interest and enthusiasm, re-enthused you, I guess, again, to be, you know, to have those conversations with the tenants and residents, and actually to get involved, and to remember that the community is important in those partnerships. So I want to say thank you very much to Chris, Claire and Dave, and hopefully you'll the audience, you'll be back with us for our next podcast, but for now, thanks very much for listening. Bye bye.